In the last episode, the South was left in a precarious position. A minor Cold War between three powers, with differing interests, began to occur between the Fellowship of Baitos, the Agari Omu Ilum, and the Jilong dynasty. This episode will discuss how this, rather poorly, plays out for all three states here. I also need to mention something that I forgot to bring up in the last video. During the war between the Dahe dynasty and the Jilong, the AOI began to secretly support the Ji. After the Dahe had seized the AOI's colony by making weapon and resource shipments directly to the Ji's army. After the war was over, at least on paper, the Ji and the AOI were in a defensive alliance. However, both states didn't trust each other, even after their common enemy was gone. The AOI not only wanted to bring their colony back, but also wanted to expand their claims on the northern coast territory, after major gold deposits were discovered in the area. While the Ji continued to occupy the former AOI colony, the Mushrooms established new ones increasingly close to the Jilong's borders. Also during the Dahe period, the Fellowship began to set up colonies on the coast as well. The Fellowship and the Dahe had worked together to build a road connecting the inner Dahe River Basin to the Fellowship's colonies to improve trade. But when the Dahe dynasty collapsed, the AOI-aligned Jilong stopped trading with the Fellowship, mostly because the Fellowship was holding a claimant to the old Quiklong Empire, who claims the entire Dahe River Basin as their own. With the Ji causing issues with both of the other powers, the alliance structure began to shift towards the AOI and the Fellowship against them, and the two powers began to talk. The Oskatan at this point had become the most powerful entity within the Fellowship, and began totally dictating the politics of the state. Alico, the leader of the Oskatan, became the de facto leader of the nation, and when he began to talk with the Mushroom leadership, it caused a huge issue with the Tisafi. The Tisafi, being the heads of the religion of Baitos, had a major issue with the state talking with beings that the religion doesn't even see as actually being people. The topic of if non-human races are actually people, and would be accepted into the next life within the Baitosian faith, would become a contentious issue for nearly the rest of history. To Alico, the opportunity of installing this exiled Quiklong Emperor back to the throne in the Dahe was a perfect excuse to gain more influence there, and spread the Baitosian faith. Alico visited the exiled emperor several times, and formally requested him to convert to Baitos in return for being installed on the throne. But he refused, citing the fact that a Baitosian emperor on the throne would probably be quickly deposed or killed. Alico would eventually drop the subject, but at this point he was already set on finding out a way to depose the Jilong. This is when the Fellowship and the Agari Omu Ilum began to have serious talks about a ground invasion into the Dahe. Though the Ji and AOI were allies on paper, the Mushrooms were all ears. It was Alico who brought up the invasion idea first. The conversation would slowly develop into a total war plan. The new alliance would launch a two-pronged attack. In the north, a Mushroom army would conquer along the northern coast towards the Dahe heartland, accompanied by the Fellowship's navy, who would blockade the Ji's main ports at the mouth of the river. In the south, a second Mushroom army and the main Fellowship army would invade through the road built originally for trade with the Dahe dynasty. After they had reached the river, the Fellowship army would go south, and the Mushroom army would go west and eventually north to surround the Ji's main army. The alliance also assumed that each nation's main ally, the Fellowship's Prislahan Trade Republic, and the AOI's Brachuria, which was formerly called the Northern Flying Fish Federation, would be opening to helping in the war, as Brachuria would be given a treaty port near a mine with raw materials, and the new government in the Dahe would be more open to trade with the Prislahana. After a peace would be made, the Agari Omu Ilum would have influence in the north, and the Fellowship of Baitos would have influence in the south. While all of this was happening, the Mushrooms, again, began to secretly have talks with the Jilong, and attempted to warn them about an incoming attack from the Fellowship. But at this point, the Ji began to seriously distrust the AOI. Eventually, when an envoy of soldiers and diplomats attempted to arrive, the Geelong murdered them via planting. Planting was when humans took mushroom prisoners and buried their bodies neck high in the sand on the beach, kind of like a plant, and waited for the tide to slowly drown them. This particular case of planting ended up killing the AOI's primary military commander of their army, causing the AOI to declare war. Suddenly, the AOI's war plan was stunted by realizing they didn't have any good enough capable commanders to lead an operation this big, so they began to look outward for somebody to lead their army, and it wasn't too long before they found him. Last episode, I skipped over many events that weren't necessary to the story, but we should revisit this one. Back all the way in Fort Ass, Joe Keto was born. Yes, that Joe Keto. And his character had the single strongest land tactics stats in the game. He eventually led a small force of something like 100 men out east to explore, and established Fort Keto east of Brachuria. His force was met when the Kingdom of Sihan and Brachuria worked together to try to expel him, but he and his small force had held the fort. Many more adventurers and thrill-seekers would begin to migrate to his fort, building his army significantly. It was this military prowess that impressed the Agari Omu Ilim, and before the war with the Geelong, hired him to lead their army. So, to summarize, the AOI and the Geelong had an alliance, but the alliance was weak, and the AOI schemed with the Fellowship to break that alliance so that both powers could forcibly receive more influence in the Dahe. The Fellowship wanted to spread their faith, and the AOI wanted control of gold and copper mines on the north coast. The AOI then tried to suddenly flip sides again and convince the Geelong that the Fellowship were going to attack them, but the G no longer trusted the mushrooms and began to murder any and all envoys sent to their land by literally planting their bodies into the sand. This caused the AOI and the Fellowship to go ahead with their plan anyway. The Dahe continues to be one of the most chaotic and insane places in the world of Inkunzi, and this reputation as the game moved forward would only embolden future players to go there and make it even more insane. Though it was sudden, the plan from the Allies sprung into action, and the armies began to move into place. In the north, the Fellowship's fleet moved into place, blockading the mouth of the Dahe River. During this time, large fleets were hard to come by, and the Fellowship had to invest a lot of money into building one. Trade with the newly established Baitojian enclaves in the former Braga Empire mostly financed the construction of this fleet. It was thought that the Fellowship had the largest fleet on the planet at this time, especially when paired with minor amounts of ships from the AOI. Trade came to a screeching halt in the Dahe, with its main road and port cut off from the world. But trade was largely affected in the Central Sea region in general. Trading ships from the Fellowship's supposed ally, the Prislahana Trade Republic, were being captured and seized by the blockaders, because the Fellowship did not give sufficient enough warning to them about the operation. The Trade Republic ended up ceasing most operations with the Fellowship for the years to come. Even worse, when the Tasafi leadership learned about this war that the Oskadan had gotten them into, it posed a serious religious issue. The Tasafi were furious that the Oskadan were using the tools of the state to support another nation that were led by mushroom people, and argued that the religion did not see them as people, and thus was sin to even address them as such, not to mention forming an alliance and launching a war at their behalf. Much of the Baitojian world would end up being split into two groups, mainline and orthodox. Orthodox wished to not engage with non-humans, and thus had to make their own churches to enforce this interpretation. The religion was split, but Alico was able to use his charisma and leadership skills to prevent the nation from breaking apart, and the war was still on. The forces of the Agari Omu Ilim successfully moved forward along the coast, coming closer and closer to the heartland of the Geelong. When they got to the mouth, they discovered something truly remarkable. Everywhere alongside the outside rivers stood gigantic new forts, towers, and defensive structures. The farmland was burned so that living off the land was impossible. The Northern Army set up for a long siege around a set of these structures. In the south, the armies of the Fellowship and the AOI faced no resistance coming down the road. However, when they got to the Dahe River, the Geelong's main force was waiting for them on the southern side. If the coalition's army wanted to engage them, they would have to cross a river. The army was also stationed right next to the city of Zongdai, and if faced with trouble, could move into it and hold the coalition to a siege. The farms on the northern side of the river were burned, forcing the hand of the coalition to cross the river. Though the Geelong had all of these defensive advantages, the coalition had a much higher quality army, and during the river crossing were able to rout the G's army. The Geelong forces, however, did not retreat to the town of Zongdai, instead giving it up and moving west. The coalition also soon realized that once the city of Zongdai learned of the Geelong's retreat, the city erupted into a pro-Dahe dynasty rebellion, and eventually the entire south was up in arms, ousting Geelong garrisons from the cities along the river. Per the agreement between the AOI and the Fellowship, the AOI continued to move west, and the Fellowship attacked and captured Zongdai, killing as many pro-Dahe dynasty rebels as they could. After the city was taken, they would move south to take their desired lands. As the Agari Omu Ilim's army marched west, the Geelong would hide, launch surprise attacks, and harass the Mushrooms as much as they possibly could to delay their advance. Both sides' casualties began to amount to the tens of thousands, far more than the AOI or the Fellowship had ever intended for a short and simple operation. Slowly, the AOI's army began to reach west, and eventually north, before coming to the same dreaded conclusion that their brothers on the northern coast had before. A massive line of forts and defensive structures surrounded entirely by a scorched earth. The Mushroom army sat in for a siege, but the wear that the defending army had already inflicted on them was heavy, and taking these forts to gain entry into the Heartland seemed nigh impossible. To top it all off, they had just received word that the Fellowship's massive fleet, which had been blockading the mouth of the river, was utterly destroyed. Later it was discovered that it was destroyed by a brand new fleet built by the Geelong in the city of Hai Dai, the former capital of the Dahe dynasty. With the blockade eliminated, the flow of resources could again trickle into the country, restocking food, equipment, and everything else they would need to hold out against the coalition. The Fellowship's ground army in the south didn't have it much better than the Mushrooms did in the north. The army would march, take a city from rebels, march some more, a new rebellion would occur somewhere else, march there, kill those rebels, etc., etc. The Fellowship began to fight a long drawn-out guerrilla war in the Dahe, attempting to install some old Chonwei lords as the new leadership in the south that the Fellowship would have full control over. As the war was fought longer and longer, the Chonwei leadership, however, began to disobey commands, refused to convert to Baitosism, and some even began to secretly aid the Dahe dynasty rebels with information about the Fellowship's military movements. The Fellowship's casualties began to climb, and with no end in sight to the war, they needed to do something fast. Alico again approached the deposed emperor of the Quick Long and told him they were bringing him back to the throne. Though he had before refused to convert to Baitos in exchange for being placed back on the throne, the Fellowship now saw him as the only real way to quell the rebellion, with a legitimate emperor on their side. The leadership of the Chonwei puppet state were all arrested, and many were killed for treason against the Fellowship. The emperor was brought into the south and placed on a throne. However, when the rebellions didn't stop, and the Fellowship's casualty numbers rose to a staggering 40,000 troops, the writing was on the wall. This was a total disaster, and the Fellowship of Baitos no longer wanted anything to do with it. Without even warning their mushroom friends, the Fellowship's army retreated back up through the desert road to the coast and abandoned the war. When the AOI realized it was now or never, they ordered an all-out attack on the forts, but not even the great Jokita was able to take them, and caused the army to retreat. For the people living in this world, it was their Vietnam, an absolutely chaotic and insane war with no real end. The AOI had made minor gains in the north that they were able to keep, but the G slowly regained lands in the central part of the country, and in the far south, the Quick Long Emperor was quickly and easily captured and killed by local Chonwei lords. If this war did anything, it was deeply, very deeply, harm the relationship between the now two great southern powers, of the Fellowship of Baitos and the Agari Omu Ilim, who would now into the future begin to scheme against each other. Due to their poor planning and general offensive ineptitude, the coalition took an estimated 120,000 casualties, mostly mushrooms, an astronomically high and insane number, while the defending G and rebellious Dahe took around 50,000. While the South had been in an insane, self-destructing war for the last 10 years of in-game time, the North had not been so different. The next two videos will visit one of the most iconic events in the game's history.